March 14th, 1977. 3:47 p.m. Falls Church, Virginia. The telephone on Margaret Harrison's kitchen counter rings during the Monday afternoon lull when the neighborhood empties of men and fills with the mechanical hum of washing machines. She's elbow deep in sudsy water, scrubbing a casserole dish, when the bell cuts through the silence of her split-level colonial. Outside, March sleet taps against the aluminum siding. The kitchen smells of Ajax and the remnants of last night's pot roast. She dries her hands on a dishcloth embroidered with roosters, a gift from the church bazaar, and lifts the avocado green receiver. "Hello?" Static crackles. Then a man's voice, accented, urgent. "Morozov. Protocol Amber. Confirm receipt." Margaret's hand, still damp, tightens on the receiver. The dishcloth drops to the linoleum floor. But through the window above her sink, she can see her neighbor Carol wheeling her trash cans to the curb, wearing a vinyl rain bonnet. The normalcy of the scene suddenly feels constructed, fragile. "You have the wrong number," Margaret says carefully. "Izvinite, sorry." The line goes dead. She stands motionless, the dial tone buzzing in her ear. Her reflection stares back from the darkened window of the microwave. A 43-year-old woman with frosted hair and bifocals, wearing a JCPenney cardigan. She replaces the receiver with deliberate slowness. The telephone is beige, push button, installed just last year when the phone company upgraded the neighborhood. She stares at it as if it might explode. In the living room, the grandfather clock strikes 4. Margaret walks to the front window and parts the curtain with one finger. Then the street looks exactly as it should. Wet asphalt, parked station wagons, Bradford pear trees beginning to bud. Nothing moves except the sleet. She returns to the kitchen and stands over the telephone. Her hand hovers above it, trembling slightly. Then she does something that will, within 72 hours, trigger the largest counterintelligence operation on American soil since the Rosenberg case. She lifts the receiver and dials a number she memorized 23 years ago, a number she swore she would never use. At FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., 16 minutes later, a duty officer in the Soviet Counterintelligence Division picks up line 7. He listens without interrupting. When the call ends, he sits motionless for 11 seconds, then reaches for the red telephone that connects directly to the director's office. Well, he speaks 3 words. "We have a walk-in." The machinery of exposure begins to turn. The official story, as it would later appear in sanitized FBI press releases and carefully managed newspaper accounts, was straightforward. An illegal Soviet intelligence officer living under deep cover in suburban Virginia had been discovered due to a technical error, a misdirected telephone call that exposed her connection to a KGB handler. The Bureau emphasized its vigilance, its sophisticated monitoring capabilities, and the patriotic cooperation of an alert citizen. President Carter was briefed. The State Department issued a stern note to Moscow. 2 Soviet diplomats were declared persona non grata and given 72 hours to leave the country. The public accepted this narrative. In 1977, though Americans were weary of spy scandals, but still hungry for Cold War victories, however small. Watergate had damaged faith in institutions. Vietnam had ended in humiliation. The CIA's domestic surveillance programs had been exposed and condemned. A clear-cut case of Soviet espionage, cleanly resolved, offered a rare moment of uncomplicated triumph. The Washington Post ran the story on page 3. Network News gave it 90 seconds. Within a week, it disappeared from headlines entirely. But inside the windowless conference rooms of Langley and the J. Edgar Hoover building, the case triggered something close to panic. The woman who had lived as Margaret Louise Harrison, a name she'd carried for 2 decades with the ease of a second skin, was actually Yelena Dmitrievna Kuznetsova, a graduate of the KGB's elite Red Banner Institute. Deployed to the United States in 1954 as part of an operation codenamed Pioneer Stock. She was not a spy in the conventional sense. She gathered no secrets. photographed no documents, recruited no agents. Her assignment was simpler and more patient: to exist. To become so thoroughly American that she could be activated in a future crisis, a war, a political upheaval, an emergency requiring someone beyond suspicion, someone who could move through American society invisible and trusted. She was what the KGB called an illegal, an intelligence officer operating without diplomatic cover, without the protection of embassy immunity, living a fabricated identity with fabricated documentation in a fabricated past. The Americans had another term, borrowed from the Soviets themselves: a sleeper agent. By 1977, U.S., the counterintelligence estimated that between 40 and 60 such agents lived somewhere in the United States, embedded in ordinary communities, waiting for orders that might never come. Margaret Harrison had waited for 23 years. She worked as a part-time librarian at Thomas Jefferson Middle School. She attended Grace Lutheran Church every Sunday, sitting in the fourth pew from the front. She volunteered for the PTA bake sale. She voted in local elections, a carefully maintained cover that required forged citizenship documents good enough to survive routine scrutiny. Her husband, Robert Harrison, had died in 1969 from a heart attack while watching the Apollo 11 landing. He had been an insurance adjuster, a Korean War veteran, a man who genuinely loved her and never knew her real name. And they had no children, a requirement of her mission, though she'd told Robert it was a medical impossibility. She paid her taxes. She complained about the weather. She kept a small vegetable garden and shared tomatoes with her neighbors. She was, in every measurable way, ordinary. The KGB had planned it that way. Pioneer Stock represented the apex of Soviet long-range planning, a program initiated by Lavrentiy Beria himself in the final months of Stalin's rule. The concept was elegant. Identify young intelligence officers with perfect English, suitable physical characteristics, and psychological stability for extended isolation, then insert them into American life during the controlled chaos of post-war migration. The early 1950s offered unique opportunities: displaced persons arriving from Europe, and Korean War veterans settling into new communities, suburbs expanding too rapidly for thorough background verification. A well-documented legend could pass inspection, especially in the bureaucratic confusion of the era. Yelena Kuznetsova became Margaret Harrison on February 18, 1954. She crossed into the United States through Canada, using documents that identified her as the daughter of a deceased Canadian mining engineer and a mother who died in childbirth. The real Margaret Harrison had existed, a child who died of pneumonia in Regina in 1933, age 7 months, leaving a birth certificate but no photographs, no memories, no one to remember her. Soviet intelligence had spent 18 months preparing the legend: employment records, school transcripts, medical files, a complete paper trail leading to a living, breathing woman who spoke English without accent, knew American geography and history and culture with the fluency of a native. At stake was nothing less than the future architecture of Cold War intelligence. Both sides understood that conventional espionage, dead drops, encrypted cables, embassy-based agents under FBI surveillance, had severe limitations. The Rosenbergs had been arrested in 1950. The Cambridge Five were under increasing suspicion in Britain. The CIA's early attempts to infiltrate agents into the Soviet Union had ended in catastrophic failures, with dozens of operatives executed within months of insertion. The balance of power demanded new strategies. For Moscow, illegals represented the ultimate insurance policy. They were impossible to detect through normal counterintelligence methods. They appeared in no Soviet files. They received no payments through traceable channels, maintained no contact with embassy personnel. They were activated only in extremis, to relay critical intelligence during a crisis when normal channels failed, to conduct sabotage operations if war came, or, most chillingly, to serve as the foundation for stay-behind networks in occupied territories if the Cold War turned hot. For Washington, the existence of such networks represented a nightmare scenario. How do you defend against an enemy who looks like your neighbor, who has lived among you for decades, who knows your routines and vulnerabilities with the intimacy of family? The FBI's Soviet Counterintelligence Division, understaffed and still reeling from the McCarthy-era's excesses, estimated it would require surveillance of hundreds of thousands of Soviet-born immigrants to identify even a handful of illegals. The mathematical improbability of success bred a culture of paranoia and frustration. By 1977, both sides had escalated their illegal programs significantly. The CIA maintained its own network of deep cover officers in the Eastern Bloc, though with far less success than Moscow's operations in the West. The KGB had expanded pioneer stock into a multi-generational project, with second-wave illegals inserted throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, many with Canadian or Mexican documentation. Some had married Americans and integrated so completely that even their spouses and children never knew. Margaret Harrison was first-generation pioneer stock, one of the originals. Her handler, operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy in Washington, was a man named Viktor Andreevich Serov, a 39-year-old line-in officer whose specialty was managing illegals across the mid-Atlantic region. He had never met Margaret in person. All communication flowed through a system of encrypted shortwave radio broadcasts, coded newspaper advertisements, and, crucially, a fail-safe telephone protocol designed for emergencies. The protocol was called Amber. It had never been used before March 14, 1977. What Margaret Harrison didn't know, what Viktor Serov didn't know, was that the telephone call exposing her had been intended for someone else entirely. The truth emerged slowly, pieced together from NSA signal intercepts, FBI surveillance logs, and classified documents that wouldn't be fully declassified until 2003. The full picture revealed an operation of such baroque complexity and fragile interdependence that its collapse seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. The call originated from a payphone at Dulles International Airport at 3:41 p.m. on March 14, 1977. The caller was Yuri Konstantinovich Baranovsky, a KGB officer assigned to the Soviet Trade Mission in New York, traveling under commercial cover as a purchasing agent for Amtorg Trading Corporation. Baranovsky was in Washington for a meeting with State Department officials regarding grain shipment contracts, routine business that provided convenient justification for his presence in the capital. His actual purpose was to activate an illegal codenamed Morozov. Morozov was not Margaret Harrison. Morozov was an entirely separate illegal, a man living under the name James Cordell in Alexandria, Virginia, working as a systems analyst for a Department of Defense contractor with security clearance for classified communications projects. Soviet intelligence had been running Morozov for 9 years. He had provided valuable technical intelligence on American satellite communication systems, radar installations, and, most recently, early data on what would become the Navstar global positioning system. He was, by KGB standards, a highly productive asset worth considerable risk to maintain. The Amber Protocol existed precisely for situations like this, when an illegal's intelligence was urgently needed and normal communication methods were too slow or had been compromised. It was a last resort system, to be used only when authorized by the KGB residency chief and only when the intelligence value justified the exposure risk. On March 14th, the Moscow Center had authorized Amber activation for Morozov. A Department of Defense contractor had received preliminary bids for a satellite guidance system that promised unprecedented precision in missile targeting. The technical specifications existed only in hard copy at the contractor's facility. Morozov had access. Moscow wanted those specifications within 48 hours, before they were distributed more widely. Baranovsky was given a single telephone number, a single code word, Morozov, and a single confirmation phrase, Protocol Amber. Confirm receipt. He was to make the call from a payphone, speak only those words, and hang up. The illegal would understand. Arrangements would be made for a dead drop within 24 hours. Simple, clean, time-tested tradecraft. But Yuri Baranovsky is standing in the den of Dulles Airport's Terminal A with flight announcements echoing overhead and travelers rushing past, misdialed. The telephone number for Morozov, James Cordell, was 703-55-50147. Baranovsky dialed 703-55-50174. The transposition was simple, the kind of error that happens when a man is nervous, rushing, reading hastily scrawled digits from a piece of paper he's supposed to have memorized. The KGB's operational security protocols mandated that handlers destroy all written notes before making contact calls. Baranovsky had violated protocol. He would later be recalled to Moscow, and his career effectively ended, though he avoided the prison sentence that might have awaited him in earlier decades. The number he actually dialed belonged to Margaret Harrison. She received a call intended for a completely different illegal, in a different town, serving a different mission. The call itself lasted 11 seconds, but those 11 seconds connected two parallel intelligence operations that were supposed to never intersect, creating a cascading exposure risk that Soviet planners had never anticipated. Margaret Harrison's response was exactly what her training demanded. She recognized the Amber Protocol. She understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Either she had been activated by mistake, or her handler had been compromised and was attempting to warn her using the emergency phrase. KGB doctrine was unambiguous. If Amber is invoked incorrectly or under suspicious circumstances, assume compromise and activate extraction procedures immediately. Extraction procedures meant one thing: call the FBI. This decision shocked American counterintelligence officials when they learned of it months later through debriefing. Why would a deep-cover Soviet illegal voluntarily expose herself to American authorities? The logic seemed suicidal, but the logic was perfect, and it revealed the sophisticated psychological architecture of the illegal program. Margaret Harrison had spent 23 years building a legend. That legend included a carefully constructed emotional reality. She genuinely believed in aspects of her cover identity. She attended church not merely as camouflage, but because the ritual provided structure and community. She mourned her husband's death with real grief. Their marriage had been arranged by the KGB, but the affection had become authentic. She had friends, genuine friends, who knew nothing of her past. She had invested decades in becoming Margaret Harrison, and that investment created its own form of loyalty. The KGB's psychological services had studied this phenomenon extensively. They called it legend assimilation, the process by which a fabricated identity begins to take on autonomous reality in the agent's consciousness. It was both the program's greatest strength and its most dangerous vulnerability. An illegal who fully assimilated could operate with perfect naturalness, free from the anxiety and behavioral tells that betray conventional spies. But full assimilation also meant that the illegal's loyalty could become ambiguous, divided between the mission and the life they had built. Moscow's solution was elegant: make defection impossible by making exposure survivable. Every pioneer stock illegal was trained in a specific protocol for voluntary exposure. If their cover was compromised, or if they received erroneous activation orders suggesting their network had been penetrated, they were instructed to contact American authorities immediately and request to defect. They would provide limited but valuable intelligence about KGB methods, tradecraft, and communication systems, enough to establish credibility. In exchange, they would receive immunity from prosecution, relocation under witness protection, and a guarantee of safety. The KGB accepted this trade-off. A defecting illegal who provided controlled intelligence was preferable to a captured illegal who might be broken through interrogation, or, worse, turned into a double agent. By encouraging voluntary defection under specific circumstances, Moscow maintained control over the exposure process. The intelligence lost was real, but manageable. The illegals' years of cover building weren't wasted. They had served their purpose by making the defection credible. More importantly, the defection protocol served as a release valve for illegals suffering from the psychological strain of their mission. The KGB's internal studies, never released publicly, but referenced in fragmentary declassified documents, showed that illegals experience severe mental health challenges after 10 to 15 years of isolation. Depression, paranoid ideation, and identity dissolution were common. The defection protocol gave them hope. If the burden became unbearable, there was a way out that didn't end in a gulag. Margaret Harrison activated that protocol 16 minutes after receiving Baranovsky's misdirected call. The FBI agent who answered her call that Monday afternoon was Thomas Edward Chin, a 32-year-old analyst with the Soviet Counterintelligence Division who had joined the Bureau in 1971 after completing a graduate degree in Russian studies at Georgetown. He had never handled a walk-in defector before. His hands were shaking slightly as he picked up the receiver. "This is Special Agent Chin. My name is Margaret Harrison. I live in Falls Church, Virginia. I am a Soviet intelligence officer." She spoke with perfect composure, as if reporting a broken streetlight. "I would like to arrange my defection." Chin's training took over. He kept his voice neutral. "Ma'am, can you please hold the line? And I need to transfer you to a supervisor. I'm at my home. The address is 4237 Fairfax Avenue. I will wait here. Please send someone quickly. If I receive that call, others may have as well. There may be very little time." She hung up. Chin sat frozen for 3 seconds, then triggered the alert protocol that would, within 90 minutes, mobilize 63 FBI personnel, 17 CIA officers, and a secure debriefing team from the National Security Agency's SIGINT Analysis Division. 4 agents in 2 vehicles arrived at 4237 Fairfax Avenue at 4:51 p.m. Margaret Harrison answered the door wearing her cardigan and bifocals, looking like someone expecting a visit from the welcome wagon. "I've made coffee," she said. "We should talk inside." The debriefing lasted 6 days. Conducted in a safe house in Bethesda that the FBI maintained for high-value defectors. Margaret Harrison provided details of her training, her insertion into the United States, the structure of her legend, and, most valuably, the communication protocols used by the KGB to manage illegals. She drew diagrams of the Red Banner Institute's training facilities from memory. She identified the shortwave frequencies used for encrypted broadcasts. She described the psychological screening process for pioneer stock candidates and the methods used to maintain operational security over decades. She also provided one piece of information that electrified American intelligence. She was not alone. Pioneer stock had deployed at least 17 illegals during the 1950s. She knew the cover names of 3 others, though not their locations or current status. She knew the general parameters of their missions. And she knew that the Amber Protocol existed for all of them, which meant that Baranovsky's error had potentially compromised the entire network. The FBI launched Operation Homestead, a nationwide effort to identify and locate Soviet illegals based on Harrison's intelligence. The investigation eventually identified 9 suspected illegals, though only 3 were definitively confirmed. 2 defected when approached. 1, a man living as a used car salesman in Tacoma, Washington, disappeared 3 days before the FBI arrived to make contact. His fate remains unknown. The others either had already been extracted by the KGB or had assimilated so completely that they were indistinguishable from genuine Americans. Meanwhile, at the Soviet embassy in Washington, Viktor Serov realized his career was finished when he heard nothing from Morozov after Baranovsky's call. He waited 48 hours, then sent an emergency cable to Moscow Center. Asset Morozov unresponsive. Assess compromise likely. Request authorization for emergency extraction procedures. Moscow's response came within 6 hours. Cease all contact Morozov. Suspend Amber Protocol, all assets Mid-Atlantic region. Prepare for immediate rotation to domestic assignment. Serov packed his apartment that night, burning documents in the bathtub and flushing the ashes. He flew to Moscow on March 19th, 5 days after Baranovsky's misdial. He would spend the next 3 years analyzing intelligence failures for the KGB's first chief directorate, a punishment assignment that kept him at a desk until his retirement in 1987. James Cordell, Morozov, continued his work at the defense contractor through June 1977, unaware that he had been compromised, unaware that his activation order had been delivered to the wrong person, unaware that the FBI was building a surveillance net around him while waiting for him to make contact with his handlers. He never made contact. The Amber Call had never reached him. On June 23rd, the FBI arrested him while he was grocery shopping at a Safeway in Alexandria. He spent 45 seconds staring at the handcuffs before saying, quietly, "I want to speak to an attorney." His trial was classified. The details remained sealed. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison under the Espionage Act and served 17 before being exchanged in a prisoner swap in 1994. He died in Moscow in 2001, having never given an interview or written a memoir. The turning point came not during Margaret Harrison's initial defection or the FBI's subsequent investigation, but 3 weeks later, on April 4th, 1977, in an office at NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland. Senior cryptologic analyst Rebecca Stein was reviewing SIGINT intercepts from Soviet embassy communications as part of routine post-defection analysis. The NSA had been monitoring diplomatic traffic for any indication of how Moscow was responding to Harrison's exposure. Most of the intercepts were routine: administrative cables about personnel rotations, innocuous trade discussions, mundane logistical arrangements. But one intercept, captured at 11:47 p.m. on April 3rd, stopped Stein cold. It was a brief transmission from Moscow Center to the KGB Residentura in Ottawa. Encrypted using a system the NSA had partially broken 18 months earlier. The decrypt was fragmentary, filled with gaps where the algorithm failed, but certain phrases were clear. Pioneer stock network compromised. Assess exposure vector. Harrison defection. Secondary risk. Amber protocol. Recommend immediate suspension. All North American illegals. Priority extraction candidates follows. Then a list of 8 code names, both partially obscured but reconstructible. Morozov, already under arrest. Blackwood, unidentified. Sentinel, unidentified. Riverbank, unidentified. Granite, unidentified. Orchard, unidentified. Nightingale, unidentified. Harrison, already defected. Rebecca Stein's analysis, completed over the next 72 hours, revealed something the FBI had missed. Margaret Harrison wasn't a lone actor or part of a small cell. She was one node in a network significantly larger than U.S. counterintelligence had estimated. The NSA intercept suggested at least 8 illegals in North America, possibly more if the fragmentary decrypt had missed names. Stein wrote a classified memorandum that landed on the desk of CIA Director Stansfield Turner on April 8th. Soviet illegal networks in North America are approximately 300% larger than current estimates. Recommend immediate expansion of counterintelligence resources and reevaluation of compromise assessment methodologies. The memo triggered a bureaucratic earthquake. The CIA and FBI had been feuding for years over jurisdiction in counterintelligence cases. The FBI insisted that domestic surveillance fell under its mandate. The CIA argued that illegals were foreign intelligence officers and therefore CIA targets. Turner's response was to propose a joint task force, an unprecedented level of cooperation that both agencies resisted. The compromise, hammered out over 6 weeks of tense negotiations, was to create a new entity, the National Counterintelligence Center, which would eventually evolve into the modern Counterintelligence Division. Its first mission was to process the intelligence from Harrison's defection and the NSA intercepts, of building a comprehensive database of suspected illegals and developing new methodologies for detecting them. But the real turning point wasn't institutional reorganization. It was a decision made by a single FBI analyst named David Kramer on April 11, 1977, a decision that would fundamentally alter how the United States approached illegal networks. Kramer was reviewing Margaret Harrison's debriefing transcripts when he noticed an anomaly. Harrison had described the Amber Protocol as a failsafe for emergencies, to be used only when authorized by Moscow Center. But the protocol's design contained an inherent vulnerability. It required telephone contact, which meant it created an electronic signature that could be detected and traced if the NSA or FBI were monitoring the right lines at the right time. Dick Kramer asked a question that seems obvious in retrospect, but was revolutionary in 1977. What if we don't arrest the illegals we find? What if we watch them instead? The logic was elegant. An arrested illegal provides one burst of intelligence, then goes silent. A watched illegal, unaware of surveillance, continues operating, potentially leading investigators to handlers, communication methods, dead drops, and, most valuably, other illegals in the network. The trade-off was risk. A monitored illegal could continue committing espionage, but the intelligence gained from mapping the entire network might justify that risk. Kramer proposed a new approach. Identify suspected illegals through Harrison's information and NSA intercepts, but instead of arresting them immediately, place them under intensive but invisible surveillance. Monitor their communications, track their movements, intercept their dead drops, and, when possible, replace genuine intelligence with doctored material to feed back into Soviet channels. The goal wasn't prosecution, it was penetration. The proposal was radical and controversial. FBI Director Clarence Kelly worried about the legal implications of allowing known foreign agents to operate on American soil. CIA officials worried about operational security. If the illegals detected surveillance, they would either go dormant or flee, wasting years of investigative work. NSA analysts worried about the resource burden. Round-the-clock surveillance of even a single illegal required dozens of personnel and significant technical infrastructure. But Turner and Kelly both recognized the potential value. They authorized a pilot program focused on a single illegal identified through the NSA intercepts, Blackwood, whose real identity remained unknown, but who was suspected of operating somewhere in the Boston-New York corridor based on communication patterns. The search for Blackwood consumed 14 months and involved surveillance of 43 individuals who matched the profile suggested by Harrison's intelligence. The breakthrough came in June 1978 when NSA intercepts identified a shortwave transmission from Boston using a frequency and encryption method Harrison had described. Triangulation placed the transmission source in Cambridge, Massachusetts. FBI teams saturated the area with surveillance, monitoring every apartment building within the signal radius. They found Blackwood on August 12, 1978. His cover name was Richard Kelso, and he worked as a freelance translator specializing in technical Russian documents for MIT and Harvard. He had lived in Cambridge since 1956. He was 51 years old, unmarried, quiet, utterly unremarkable. The FBI watched him for 11 months without making contact. During that time, he transmitted intelligence twice, received coded instructions through shortwave broadcasts 4 times, and serviced a dead drop in Boston Common on 3 occasions. On the 3rd dead drop, the FBI didn't just observe. They intercepted the material Kelso was leaving, technical documents about MIT's artificial intelligence research, and replaced them with doctored versions containing subtle errors. The altered documents made their way back to Moscow Center. 6 months later, NSA intercepts revealed Soviet engineers struggling with flawed data in their own AI programs, citing source Blackwood as the origin. The FBI had successfully penetrated a Soviet intelligence network not by destroying it, but by corrupting it from within. The success of the Blackwood operation established a new paradigm. Over the next decade, U.S. counterintelligence shifted from a reactive model focused on arrests and prosecution to a proactive model focused on identification, monitoring, and manipulation. Illegals became assets in a deeper game, unknowing participants in a counterintelligence theater where the Americans controlled the script. This approach required patience, resources, and absolute secrecy. It also required accepting that enemy agents would continue operating on American soil, potentially for years, but before any disruption occurred. The moral calculus was uncomfortable, but pragmatically sound. Better to map the network completely and corrupt its output than to arrest individuals and leave the rest of the network intact and functioning. Margaret Harrison never knew her defection had triggered this transformation. She lived out her remaining years under a new identity in a small town in Oregon, working as a librarian, not so different from her life in Falls Church, except this time the name was real. The FBI maintained periodic contact, interviewing her occasionally about KGB methods as new questions arose. She died in 1998 at age 64 from complications of emphysema. Her obituary identified her as Margaret Louise Thompson, beloved librarian and church volunteer. 3 people attended the funeral. That the revelation of the full story came in stages, spread across 2 decades, and contingent on bureaucratic decisions about declassification and the slow, grinding work of investigative journalists and historians piecing together fragments. The first public indication that the Margaret Harrison case involved more than a simple walk-in defection appeared in a 1985 Senate Intelligence Committee report on FBI counterintelligence operations. The report, heavily redacted, mentioned a defected illegal in 1977 whose information led to a significant expansion of surveillance operations against Soviet networks. No names were provided. The Washington Post ran a brief story on page A17. The second revelation came from Yuri Baranovsky himself. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Baranovsky published a memoir in Moscow in 1994 titled Errors in Tradecraft. The book described his career in the KGB with unusual candor, including his acknowledgement of the misdial that compromised Pioneer stock. Russian intelligence veterans criticized the memoir as a breach of professional ethics, but Baranovsky was elderly, poor, and suffering from terminal cancer. He died 3 months after publication. The memoir sold poorly in Russia and was never translated into English, remaining obscure until a CIA analyst stumbled across it while researching Soviet illegal programs in 2001. The third and most comprehensive revelation occurred in 2003 when the FBI declassified portions of its file on Operation Homestead, the investigation triggered by Harrison's defection. The declassified documents, released under Freedom of Information Act pressure from the Cold War International History Project, revealed the scope of the Pioneer stock network and the FBI's decision to monitor, rather than arrest, identified illegals. Several historians noted the irony. The FBI's most successful counterintelligence operation of the late Cold War became public only after the Cold War had ended, and most of the principals were dead. Among the declassified documents was Margaret Harrison's original debriefing transcript, 347 pages of questions and answers that revealed the mundane details of a life spent in deception. One exchange, from April 21st, 1977, captured the existential strangeness of her situation. FBI Agent Chen: did you ever consider actually defecting earlier, before you received the Amber Call? Harrison: I thought about it. Especially after Robert died. I was very lonely, but I didn't know how. The defection protocol only applied if I was compromised. If I just walked into an FBI office without evidence, without proof of my identity, what would you have done? Investigated me for 6 months while I sat in detention? I had no proof. All my documentation said I was Margaret Harrison. I was Margaret Harrison. Chen. But you weren't. You were Yelena Kuznetsova. Harrison. Was I? I haven't spoken Russian conversationally in 20 years. I dream in English. I think in English. When I pray in English to a Lutheran God I wasn't raised to believe in. But I believe now. Who was I, Agent Chen? Who am I now? The transcript shows that Chen had no answer. The Blackwood case remained classified until 2008, when a former FBI official mentioned it during a lecture at the National Defense University. The official, speaking on background, described the operation as the first successful, long-term penetration of a Soviet illegal network through surveillance and manipulation rather than arrest. The revelation triggered renewed FOIA requests, and in 2011, the FBI released a partial file confirming that Richard Kelso, Blackwood, had been monitored for nearly 2 years before his eventual arrest in 1980. He was convicted of espionage in a closed trial and sentenced to 30 years. He was exchanged in a prisoner swap in 1986 and returned to the Soviet Union, where he disappeared into obscurity. The full list of pioneer stock illegals identified through Harrison's defection and subsequent investigation was declassified in 2019. Of the 17 illegals Harrison believed had been deployed, 3 defected, including Harrison. 4 were arrested and prosecuted. 2 died of natural causes before identification. 1 disappeared and is presumed to have been extracted by the KGB. 7 were never definitively identified, despite years of investigation. The classified annex to the 2019 release, still partially redacted, suggests that some of the unidentified illegals may have successfully completed their missions and returned to the Soviet Union undetected, or may have assimilated so completely that they effectively ceased to be Soviet agents, living out their lives as genuine Americans with no contact with Moscow. No careers of senior American intelligence officials ended directly because of the Harrison case. Instead, several careers were made. Thomas Chen, the agent who took Harrison's initial call, became a senior counterintelligence official and helped develop the methodologies that would later be used against Russian intelligence networks in the post-Cold War era. He retired in 2004. Rebecca Stein, the NSA analyst who decoded the critical Moscow Center cable, received the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal in a classified ceremony in 1978. She left government service in 1989 and became a professor of cryptography at Stanford. Yuri Baranovsky, whose misdial exposed the network, was quietly retired from the KGB in 1978 and assigned to teach tradecraft at a training facility outside Moscow. His later memoir suggested he was haunted by the error. I destroyed the work of hundreds of people with 7 misdialed digits. It was not malice. But it was not incompetence in the ordinary sense. It was simply human error, the kind that occurs 1,000 times a day, everywhere in the world. But in intelligence work, there is no such thing as a simple error. Every mistake is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Viktor Serov, Harrison's former handler, ended his career in bureaucratic purgatory analyzing intelligence reports. He retired in 1987 and moved to a village outside St. Petersburg, where he died in 2011. His obituary in a local newspaper mentioned his career in diplomatic service, but provided no details. The most intriguing loose end concerns James Cordell, the illegal known as Morozov. After his release in the 1994 prisoner exchange, Cordell gave a single interview to a Russian newspaper in 1997. In it, and he made a cryptic statement. The woman in Virginia who defected, she made the right choice. She got to keep her life. I got my life back, but it wasn't the life I'd built. She was smarter than both of us. When pressed to explain, Cordell refused to elaborate. He died 4 years later, leaving no memoir and no further comment. The lasting impact of the Harrison case on Cold War strategy was subtle but profound. Less a revolution than a recalibration of intelligence tradecraft and risk assessment. The immediate policy change was administrative. The FBI and CIA established formal protocols for joint counterintelligence operations, targeting illegals, codified in a classified National Security Decision Directive signed by President Carter in November 1977. The directive mandated information sharing between agencies. They created the institutional framework for what would become the National Counterintelligence Center and authorized the surveillance over arrest approach pioneered in the Blackwood case. More significantly, the Harrison defection forced both Moscow and Washington to confront the fragility of long-term illegal programs. The KGB's internal review, fragments of which appeared in Baranovsky's memoir and later in files from the Mitrokhin archive, concluded that illegals represented an asset class with diminishing returns over time. The longer an illegal remained in place, the more they assimilated, and the more vulnerable they became to both detection and psychological deterioration. The review recommended shorter deployment cycles, more frequent rotations, and better psychological support systems, recommendations that were partially implemented in the 1980s, but never fully realized before the Soviet Union's collapse. For American counterintelligence, the lesson was different. Patience yields better intelligence than prosecution. The FBI's shift toward long-term surveillance operations against suspected illegals became a model for how the U.S. would later handle Russian intelligence networks in the post-Soviet era. When the FBI arrested 10 Russian illegals in 2010 in what became known as the Illegals Program case, the agents had been under surveillance for years before arrest, with the Bureau gathering comprehensive intelligence about their networks, communication methods, and handlers. The approach traced directly to lessons learned from Operation Homestead. The Harrison case also accelerated development of new technologies for detecting illegals. The NSA's success in intercepting and partially decrypting the Moscow Center cable that revealed the scope of Pioneer stock led to expanded investment in SIGINT capabilities targeting Soviet communications. By the early 1980s, the NSA had developed sophisticated algorithms for identifying patterns in encrypted traffic that might indicate illegal activity, a precursor to modern signals intelligence and metadata analysis. On the human level, the case prompted the FBI to develop new psychological profiles for identifying illegals. David Kramer, whose insight about surveillance over arrest transformed the Bureau's approach, went on to establish the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Program for Counterintelligence, applying psychological profiling techniques to foreign agent detection. The program operated from 1982 until 1997 with mixed results, successfully identifying several suspected illegals, but also generating numerous false positives that wasted investigative resources. The broader intelligence community drew a darker lesson. In a world where a single misdial could compromise years of careful work, human error represented an intolerable vulnerability. This recognition accelerated the trend toward automation and technological solutions in intelligence operations. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology received increased funding for secure communication systems. The NSA expanded its satellite surveillance programs, while the KGB invested heavily in dead-drop technology, elaborate hiding places for intelligence materials that eliminated the need for direct handler-agent contact. But technology couldn't eliminate the human element. In 1985, 8 years after Harrison's defection, CIA counterintelligence officer Aldrich Ames began spying for the Soviets, compromising dozens of American assets and operations. His betrayal demonstrated that the greatest vulnerabilities in intelligence work remained human: greed, resentment, ego, and the infinite capacity for rationalization. Harrison's defection had exposed the fragility of illegal networks. Ames's betrayal exposed the fragility of the organizations trying to combat them. Margaret Harrison lived long enough to learn about Ames's arrest in 1994. According to her FBI case officer's notes from a follow-up interview that year, She expressed no satisfaction at the news, only weary recognition. We're all playing the same game. Sometimes the Russians lose. Sometimes the Americans lose. Mostly, the people who lose are the ones who believed in something. Their country, their mission, their cover story. The ones who survive are the ones who never really believed in anything except survival. She declined to elaborate. In the decades following Harrison's defection, at least 11 former Soviet illegals were identified through various means: defections, document discoveries, post-Soviet archival releases. None achieved the level of integration that Harrison had. Several had been extracted before arrest. Some had failed psychologically and been recalled to Moscow. A few had simply disappeared, their fates unknown. The question that haunted American counterintelligence officials, and that remains unanswered even after extensive declassification, is how many illegals were never found. The Mitrokhin archive, smuggled out of Russia in 1992 by former KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, suggested that Soviet illegal programs deployed over 400 officers to Western countries between 1945 and 1991. The FBI's best estimates, based on Harrison's intelligence and subsequent investigations, identified fewer than 50 during the same period. The mathematics suggest a troubling possibility. Hundreds of illegals completed their missions undetected, either returning to the Soviet Union with their covers intact or assimilating so completely that they ceased to function as intelligence officers and simply became the Americans they pretended to be. In 2015, a woman named Dorothy Miller died in a nursing home in Denver at age 87. She had lived in Colorado since 1959, working various jobs: bank teller, real estate agent, volunteer at the public library. She never married. She had few friends and no surviving family. Her estate, valued at $47,000, was left to the local animal shelter. While processing her apartment, the estate executor found a locked metal box in the back of her bedroom closet. Inside were items that made no sense in the context of Dorothy Miller's documented life. A Soviet passport issued in 1957 to a woman named Natalia Sokolova, and several pages of handwritten notes in Russian, a photograph of a young woman in a Red Army uniform, and a small leather-bound notebook filled with shortwave radio frequencies. The executor contacted the FBI. The Bureau investigated, but could find no evidence that Dorothy Miller had engaged in espionage or maintained contact with Soviet intelligence. The passport appeared genuine, but had never been used for travel. The notebook's frequencies were decades out of date. The photograph, analyzed by forensic specialists, matched Dorothy Miller's facial structure aged back 40 years. The FBI's final assessment: she contained in a classified file that was partially declassified in 2018. Subject Miller was likely a Soviet illegal deployed in the late 1950s who ceased operational activity at an unknown date and lived out her life under cover identity without detection. No evidence of ongoing intelligence activity. No evidence of contact with handlers post-1965. Assessed subject chose to remain in the United States after original mission parameters became obsolete or after psychological break with Soviet intelligence services. Case closed due to subject's death and absence of actionable intelligence. Dorothy Miller, if that assessment is correct, achieved what Margaret Harrison perhaps wanted but couldn't have. She became the person she was pretending to be, and she kept that life until the end. The file sits in a box at the National Archives, 2 facility in College Park, Maryland. The box is labeled FBI Case File 177-HQ-1456. Harrison, Margaret Louise, Defector. Inside are 4,127 pages of documents: debriefing transcripts, surveillance logs, NSA intercepts, analytical memos, and a single photograph. The photograph shows a woman in her early 40s, standing in a kitchen, wearing a cardigan and bifocals. She's holding a dish towel and looking at something outside the frame. The photograph was taken by FBI surveillance on March 15, 1977, the day after her defection, while she was still in her home waiting for the debriefing team to arrive. She doesn't look like a spy. She looks like someone's aunt, someone's neighbor, someone who brings casseroles to church potlucks and waters the tomatoes in her garden. Yet in the bottom right corner of the photograph, barely visible, is a beige telephone. Push button, newly installed, the kind that was becoming standard in suburban homes in 1977. The photograph doesn't capture the telephone ringing, doesn't freeze the moment when the wrong number connected two parallel worlds and collapsed a network built over decades. But the telephone sits there in the frame, silent and ordinary, a reminder that the most consequential moments in intelligence history often hinge on the smallest accidents. The question that remains, unanswerable even after decades of investigation and analysis, is whether the collapse of pioneer stock represented a genuine counterintelligence victory or merely the exposure of one network among many. Margaret Harrison provided intelligence about 17 illegals. The FBI identified fewer than half. The others remained shadows in the historical record, names in fragmentary documents, code names in partially decrypted cables, ghosts who may have lived and died as Americans without anyone ever knowing who they really were. In 2003, a researcher at the National Security Archive obtained the declassified Homestead files and spent 6 months analyzing the investigation's scope and limitations. Her conclusion, published in a journal article that received little public attention. The Harrison case revealed less about the success of American counterintelligence than about the fundamental impossibility of the task. How do you defend against an enemy who has become indistinguishable from the people you're trying to protect? How do you identify a threat that has successfully ceased to be a threat because the person carrying it has forgotten who they were? The researcher, Dr. Elena Vasquez, noted one final irony. In her analysis of the psychological profiles of known Soviet illegals, she found a consistent pattern. The most successful illegals, those who remained undetected longest, were not the ones who most rigorously maintained their cover, but the ones who stopped maintaining it consciously and simply lived as the people they were pretending to be. Margaret Harrison defected because she received a telephone call that shattered the illusion. But what about the ones who never received that call? What about the illegals who integrated so completely that they forgot they were supposed to be waiting for orders? What about the ones who died in their beds? And surrounded by American grandchildren, never having transmitted a single piece of intelligence after the initial years, having simply become Americans? The intelligence community has a term for this phenomenon: lost to assimilation. It appears in classified assessments and debriefing analyses with clinical detachment, as if it's simply another category of operational failure. But it represents something more profound: the possibility that identity is not a fixed thing, but a performance that becomes real through repetition, and that a spy who plays a role long enough may cease to be a spy at all. Somewhere in America, according to statistical models developed by the FBI in the 1980s and refined in the 2000s, there are people living ordinary lives who were once someone else entirely. They might be elderly now, retired, spending their days in quiet routines. They might not remember the training, the mission briefings, the ideological conviction that once justified everything. They might not remember the names they were born with. They might not remember that they were supposed to be remembered. The telephone that started everything, the beige push-button phone in Margaret Harrison's kitchen, no longer exists. It was removed by FBI technicians during the initial investigation, logged into evidence, and eventually destroyed according to standard protocols for handling material from counterintelligence cases. But telephones exactly like it still exist in homes across America. Silent witnesses to countless small accidents and wrong numbers, most of which lead nowhere, mean nothing, change nothing, except when they do.